Welcome to Safety Spectrum, your environmental health and safety connection. This program is a presentation of the Michigan Safety Conference. For almost a century, the annual conference has provided credible educational opportunities and valuable support to the safety and health practitioner by offering 120 instructional programs, along with exhibits highlighting the latest in safety equipment, instrumentation, and demonstrations. To learn more about the conference, please find us at MICH, safetyconference.org.
Welcome to Safety Spectrum. I'm your host, Sheila Ide. This program is sponsored by the Michigan Safety Conference, and our topic today is exploring another pandemic tragedy with our guest, Dr. Peter Savolainen. When the nation shut down and driving diminished, some very surprising trends were discovered. Our speaker today will explain what his research revealed. Dr. Peter Savolainen is a foundation professor and associate chair for graduate studies in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Michigan State University. He has served as a principal holder or lead investigator on more than $20 million worth of funded research from agencies such as the Federal Highway Administration, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and various state departments of transportation. This research has led to the publication of more than 100 peer-reviewed articles and research reports contributing to the areas of traffic safety, highway design, naturalistic driving, and safety, and risk management and statistical and econometric methods of transportation data analysis. Thank you for joining me today, Pete.
Thanks, Sheila. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, let's get started. What got you interested in this type of research?
Okay, so historically, when we look at traffic safety, the number of traffic crashes, injuries, and fatalities we experience year to year is largely going to be a function of how much travel is occurring. And so, for example, we've seen significant declines in crashes and fatalities during the Second World War, in the 1970s during the energy crisis, and then more recently with the economic recession in 2008 and 2009. And so in each of those circumstances, travel went down by fairly large degrees for various reasons, and we saw that crashes, injuries, and fatalities did as well. And so going into the pandemic, obviously a lot of terrible things happened, but we were hopeful as safety researchers that the reduction in travel we saw would have corresponded to saving lives, essentially, because we'd have fewer crashes resulting in fatalities. And when we looked at it at a very aggregate level, overall crashes were still down by roughly 22% comparing 2020 to 2019. But the surprising part was that traffic fatalities were actually up by 10% here in Michigan. And that mirrored a lot of trends that we saw nationally. As across the US, there was more than a 7% increase in traffic fatalities from 2019 to 2020. So everybody was really experiencing some of these same issues. And so consequently, like many of these other researchers across the US, this is an issue that we felt warranted a significant amount of investigation. And so that's what had kind of piqued our interest.
Yeah, that's surprising. So crashes were down, but fatalities are up.
Exactly.
I guess we just can't attribute that to less driving, because obviously something else is going on. So traffic was significantly down due to the pandemic, but what do you think the reasons are for the increases on the fatalities?
So this is where things get a little bit tricky, because there were a lot of changes that were introduced during the pandemic in terms of travel overall, and that includes who was traveling, when they were traveling, and how they were traveling as well. And so as an example, particularly during the early stages of the pandemic, a lot of people transitioned to telecommuting. And so we had fewer people on the roads generally, and the people that were on the roads tended to be essential workers. And so that could run the gamut from medical professionals to people that are working in retail, grocery stores that had to stay open, and so forth. And we saw significant reductions in long distance travel and travel across state lines due to some of the travel restrictions that were in place. And then the pandemic had also introduced some issues for things like transit systems. And so bus or light rail transit subway systems in various areas of the country, some of those had either closed down or significantly changed their mode of operation. And so as a consequence of that, we also saw increases in terms of the number of people who were walking and bicycling. And so there was really this big confluence of factors that were contributing. Now, if you look at a lot of the research that's discussed this issue nationally, a lot of this has been attributed to speed. So inherently, if there are fewer people on the roads, lower levels of traffic congestion, people are able to go faster as a consequence of that. And of course, they generally would. And so when we look at the numbers of crashes, and particularly fatal crashes where the officer investigating the crash attributes it to speed, those percentages have gone up significantly. And so I guess intuitively, we would think about our highest speed roads. So we've had speed limit increases up to 75 miles per hour here on much of our rural interstate system. And when we look at those highest speed roads, we do see fatality increases of 6 to 8% generally. But as we dug deeper into the data, it was somewhat interesting for us to see that the increases tended to be most pronounced on some of the lower speed roads. And so as an example, when we compare 2020 to 2019, we saw a 30% increase in fatalities on 30-mile-per-hour roads and a 98% increase, so nearly a doubling of fatal crashes on 25-mile-per-hour roads.
That doesn't even make sense. Now, did that include just car crashes, or did that include pedestrian, bikers, or just fatalities in general?
So that would be across all traffic fatalities. And to your broader point, a lot of what's contributing to that would be the shift to more people walking and bicycling, and then combining that with the fact that vehicles are traveling faster on these roads where people walk and bike because there's less traffic there overall. So if we look here in Michigan statewide, pedestrian fatalities were up 17%. And bicyclist fatalities were up 81%. And so those numbers are pretty staggering. And again, those are inherently our most vulnerable road users. They don't have the same protection that you'd have in an automobile, obviously. And so those circumstances can be quite severe. And those are the types of crashes also where drivers often have difficulty due to in-vehicle and out-of-vehicle distractions. Oftentimes, you'll hear the driver say, well, I never saw the pedestrian or I never saw the bicyclist as a consequence. And especially if they're going at higher speeds, they have less time to see and react to those individuals as well. And so I think speed is definitely playing a big role here. And then another factor is just simply changes in terms of the nature of travel. So if we think about where those travel changes were most pronounced, I think intuitively we might have thought we'd see larger increases on the highest speed roads, but that's also where the traffic volumes fell off the most because people weren't making long distance trips, right? It was largely just local.
They weren't commuting. Yeah.
Local essential trips. And so I think a disproportionate amount of traffic tended to then occur on those local roads, which is helping to drive things as well to a degree. And so those are a few of the issues that we're looking at various levels of detail at present.
So I don't know if you can break it down this far, but would it be more in urban areas like downtown where people aren't normally driving, they have the mass transportation to use, or was it out on, some of the smaller roads, country roads, that type of thing, you're not going to have the lighting, situation that you have downtown. So did you see where these were occurring? I know you said it was more local roads and lower speeds, but was it urban areas, country areas, just all over?
Yeah, so we looked regionally across the state of Michigan, and interestingly, fatalities had actually gone down in the Superior region, which includes the Upper Peninsula. Now, being from there myself, I'd like to claim that that's due to the fact that we're much better drivers, but there's a lot that's probably happening there. But the biggest increases, interestingly, were in the Metro Detroit area, where fatalities increased by nearly 25%. We also saw fairly large increases in the Grand Rapids area, in the University region, which would include East Lansing and Ann Arbor. And in the Bay region, which would be Flint, Saginaw, et cetera. So generally speaking, we saw most of those increases occur in the more urban areas.
Okay.
And interestingly, that's also where we tended to see the most travel reductions, the most COVID restrictions put into place. And so I'm kind of curious to see, in greater detail what's been happening there. Now, generally speaking, we have better and more comprehensive data for the higher speed roadways. And so we're still in the process of investigating what's happening on some of these lower speed roadways. But across the board, we did tend to see that speed was continuing to play a role here. And so that's a theme that's been recurring here in Michigan and also nationally.
Well, since you opened the upper door, it seems like animals were more prevalent and roaming a lot more because people were staying home, and we saw a lot more animals. Did you notice any data related to like deer car accidents, or was that pretty much the same? It's Michigan after all.
Yeah, I had not even looked into that specific issue to this point. I think on an annual basis, we'd have anywhere from, I think, 50 to 60,000 animal involved crashes across the state. And so I've not looked at that specifically.
Again, these are intuitive thoughts, like even people that are not normally driving. You talk about mass transportation being closed down. There probably were some inexperienced drivers, perhaps, that had not driven for a while. It probably figured into some of this.
Yeah, and that's somewhat of an interesting question. I've talked to some of my colleagues about. So if we look just at the trends and fatalities over the course of the pandemic, during the first few months when we saw the largest travel reductions, when we saw a lot of the stay-at-home orders introduced, we did see fairly large decreases in fatalities during those periods. So I think in March and April, we were down between 25 and 30% as compared to the prior year. Now, by the time we got to May, we were basically back to where we had been in 2019. And it was really during the summer where we saw huge increases. And so we saw a 60% increase in fatals in June, 30% in July, and 40% in August. And so when we look at those time periods, traffic was starting to come back up. So some of those stay-at-home orders were starting to be lifted. We saw more travel generally, but it was still lower travel than we saw in the preceding years. So then the natural question is, well, things are largely similar. And so what's really driving that? And so that's what we're trying to figure out now largely. So one question is, is rust a factor here? Many people either hadn't been driving as much, or to your point, maybe weren't driving at all because they were using transit systems. And so I think we just become accustomed to driving, and it's largely second nature. You can drive, 20 miles and not necessarily remember in detail anything you saw over those 20 miles.
Exactly.
And so there might be some recalibration there, and drivers getting adjusted to getting back behind the wheel again. Unfortunately, that's something that's largely speculation on my part, because we typically don't have that level of detail in terms of what's happening inside the vehicles. We've got really good data that we collect from roadside sensors or sensors under the pavement that tell us how much traffic is occurring and when, but we don't have, the big brother type system where we know exactly who's in those vehicles. And so the nature of travel may have changed there as well. I think we did see some interesting trends in terms of specific groups of drivers who are at risk. And this has been fairly consistent with some of our historical research. So as an example, when we look at fatal crashes, one of the big differences when you compare data between all crashes and fatal crashes specifically is restraint use. So here in Michigan, we've historically been between 92 and 94% belt use over the past decade or so now at this point. But when we look just at fatal crashes, that belt use rate drops to about 60% or so. And so if we could just take care of that small percentage of drivers who are not belted, that could help to drive those fatality numbers down further. Now, when we look at the data from 2020, we see that the belt use in the fatal crashes was down about 5%, which suggests, I guess, to my preceding point, it may have been a different group of drivers. I don't necessarily think people suddenly altered their behavior and were less likely to drive belted, as an example. But we also did see some decreases overall. We do an annual seatbelt use survey for the Michigan Office of Highway Safety Planning. And so we have seen some declines in belt use that have occurred as well. And so in addition to seeing higher proportions of unbelted fatalities, we saw larger percentages of fatals that involve drinking and driving. And I'm sure if we drill down further, you tend to see these same risk factors. So people that don't wear their seatbelts, don't wear their helmets, drink and drive, speed, drive without appropriate licensing or insurance. We see that same mix of kind of bad behaviors occurring consistently when we look at traffic crashes and specifically fatal crashes. And so I think as we move forward, I'm very interested to see what happens to some of these trends moving forward, and trying to understand just the nature of what drove a lot of these increases.
It's got to be really hard to get the right statistics to prove some of these, like say, intuitive thoughts. I mean, I wonder if fatigue is a factor. You had the essential workers were working more hours than they're used to and coming in earlier, staying later, that sort of thing. But I don't imagine any of that is tracked either. Like you say, what's going on inside the car doesn't get tracked.
Yeah, it's very challenging. There's been numerous research studies that suggest anywhere from 90 to 95% of crashes are due, at least in some part, to driver error or driver mistakes, right?
Right.
And when we think about those mistakes, some of the ones that have become most prevalent, or at least received a lot of the attention in the traffic safety community, are fatigue, to your point, driver distraction, and some of these other problematic behaviors. But unfortunately, when we look at the nature of crash reporting, the investigating officer goes out to the scene and they'll collect information from the driver and occupants of the vehicle, from witnesses, et cetera. And generally speaking, those individuals aren't going to be inclined to say, oh, sorry, I was asleep, or I was fatigued, or I was on my cell phone when that crash occurred.
Right.
And so we know that there's very consistent underreporting of some of those behaviors. Now, we have investigated some of those issues in detail using what's referred to as naturalistic driving data. So as an example, we've got a series of ongoing projects where we're leveraging data that were collected from roughly 3,400 drivers who were monitored for a period of 1 to 3 years using a series of sensors, cameras, et cetera. And so we have data on millions of trips. And so in looking at those data, we'll find, for example, that distraction was prevalent in whether that's someone on the cell phone or talking to a passenger or looking at something external to the vehicle that's not the road environment. We saw distraction in roughly 60% of those leading up to those crash and near crash events. And so unfortunately, I don't have any comparison data over the pandemic, because those data were collected 5 to 8 years ago now at this point. But I'm sure there are ways we're trying to get at some of those answers. And I guess as one example, there's survey research that's being done across the country. Now there you do run into those same issues in terms of how honest or truthful people will be in reporting their behaviors there, but it's very challenging to try to get to the very fundamental level of what individual drivers are doing. So, a lot of it's just a matter of what we're able to observe while being unobtrusive in a normal driving environment. So I think there's probably a whole lot of interesting questions that we have that are just simply somewhat challenging for us to try to explicitly investigate at this point.
Understandable. Don't some of the insurance companies offer that type of monitoring to reduce your rates? At least that's how I understand the commercials. Same type of thing you're talking about.
Yep, exactly. So you can basically put a sensor or diagnostic unit on your vehicle, and it will track things like acceleration, deceleration behavior, speed selection behavior, et cetera. And we're actually working with Ford right now on a project where we're leveraging some of those data. And so it's probably unsurprising to see, for example, the areas on the roadway, specific roads or intersections that experience a lot of crashes also experience a large number of maybe near crash events or precursors where people would slam on the brakes beyond a certain threshold, or they would change their lateral acceleration. So basically jerk the wheel really quickly. And so we've seen fairly good data there. And that's something we could potentially look at as a mechanism. So if we looked at how frequently those different types of events varied between 2019 and 2020, there might be some insights we could draw there as well, I think.
Well, I know you're a man who relies on data and statistics, so pull out your crystal ball for a minute. Do you think in the future we're going to have more of that now that we're getting automatic driving and driverless driving? Do you think we're going to be able to track these things better, or are we just going to eliminate the driver?
There's a whole lot involved in that question, certainly. So I guess as one example, and I guess back to my prior comment about some of the survey research. So we've got a project that's ongoing right now where we're trying to do a few different things. One, we're assessing how effective automatic emergency braking systems are. And so these are being installed almost universally now on any new vehicles. And so when you're driving and there's an object in front of you in the roadway, Vehicles are equipped with a series of sensors and cameras, and they can basically help to identify these objects, warn the driver through a forward collision warning system, and actually begin to apply the brakes automatically. And so we've got access to some test data from the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, and we're currently evaluating how effective these systems are in stopping under idealized conditions. So basically they have test track environments, and we see they perform relatively well, but they tend to perform less well as speeds get higher, as an example, as conditions get worse. So a lot of crashes, particularly fatals, will occur at nighttime, and so things of that nature. But then secondly, related to that and the point of automation generally, a lot of drivers aren't necessarily comfortable with those technologies. So I had a vehicle previously that had an early version of AEB, and there would be certain points in the road environment on my daily commute where I knew it would always think there was an issue. And so it would prompt the alert and it would start to apply my brakes. And so I got frustrated and turned the system off. And so consumer trust with that technology, I think, is a big issue. So we had actually surveyed 1,000 Michigan residents in terms of how comfortable they were with that technology. And there were a fairly large number who were not comfortable with AEB specifically. And we looked at various types of assistive technologies. And so drivers generally like things like warnings that are introduced by those systems, whether it's an audible warning, or some light coming up on the dash. But as that vehicle was starting to be given more control, drivers become somewhat less comfortable. And so I think that's a really interesting question moving forward is kind of what happens with some of those types of technologies.
I was contemplating that myself, as I see they've got ones that avoid, side collisions or front or rear collisions. They park themselves. And as a driver of, well, shall we say more than 50 years, I think it would be difficult to adjust my driving to trust, like you say, trust the vehicle. And there have been crashes with these non-driver cars. So, I'm not sure the technology is there, but I think it would take a whole retraining of some of us who've been driving for years to be comfortable with that, for sure. But I think eventually it'll be the Jetson world and we won't even have to think about it, right? We'll read War and Peace while we're driving to Chicago or something.
Yeah, I'm very curious to see that. Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion, I think a lot of speculation, but that'll be a very long process, I think. And there's a whole lot of hurdles, legislatively, privacy related, and then to,
Absolutely.
The effectiveness of the technologies as well. And so even to that point, as a part of our evaluation of AEB systems, just over the model years, I think we've got maybe 2013 through 2021, we have seen significant improvements in the technologies over that time period. And so it keeps getting better and better. And I think one thing that kind of works against us is, nearly 40,000 people die every year in traffic crashes across the US. And you typically don't see a lot of coverage of that in the news necessarily, except on a very localized basis. But if you have one self-driving vehicle fatality, that's on the news, for weeks or months. And so I think that's going to be one of the big challenges here is that those self-driving vehicles, there's fairly extensive data that shows that the crash risks are significantly lower as compared to normal human drivers, but there are unresolved questions in terms of liability and things of that nature. And to that end, humans are generally not very good at assessing risk. And so, given how frequently people drive, there's a lot of behaviors where, people don't perceive that that's introducing a meaningful increase in their crash risk, or things like cell phone use or things of that nature. They're just not particularly good at balancing those risks. And again, those are, the types of behaviors that contribute to traffic crashes and fatalities ultimately.
Yeah, you're right that we hear about the dramatic crash. And if you said the stats show that the driverless cars are safer, I mean, that's a stat that I could get behind. I can understand that. To back it up a little bit, you mentioned how the numbers went up in the summer, June and July or May, as people started to go back to work. Isn't there normally an increase in the summertime with people on pleasure type driving, vacation type driving? Is there a difference there?
Yeah, we do tend to see higher numbers of crashes and fatalities during the summer months as well. And so when I talked about the preceding percentages, though, those were basically normalizing comparing to the same time period the year prior. So the risks were even higher during those time periods than they would be in a quote unquote normal year, if we can even use that term anymore.
Yeah, what is normal? So what do you see happening as we move forward out of pandemic? Of course, a lot of companies are still shut down. Surprisingly, a lot of them are back, but several are still holding out for till next year. What do you see going forward? What can improve? What could get worse?
I think that's a really interesting question. And I guess to your initial point there, I'm kind of curious to see what employers do generally. And so we've recently made the decision here at MSU that we're going to be offering all of our courses in person. I should probably knock on wood as I say that, but for a long period, we've been telecommuting, and we still have a lot of staff across the university who will continue to telecommute, at least to some degree. And I know employers are handling things differently. I've got colleagues in some state organizations who plan to work remotely moving forward. We've got others where it'll be kind of a mix. And so that'll have some interesting repercussions in terms of traffic patterns, for example. And so one thing that could happen is our traditional rush hour traffic might not be as bad if people kind of spread out kind of when they're traveling, as an example. And we've got more telecommuting. And then as I think about that, it's kind of a balance as well, because to where we had started with this discussion, if there are fewer people on the road during those periods, speeds tend to be higher as well. And so we might have kind of a strange mix in terms of what the implications of those travel decisions and policies are on traffic safety ultimately, I think. And then beyond that, there's been a lot of coverage recently of the increases in cases we've seen due to the Delta variant. And so we've done a bit of research just to look at how effective some of these travel restrictions have been at reducing traffic and trying to improve social distancing. And what we generally found is that when those were first introduced back in March, April of 2020, they were quite effective. We saw reductions of up to 60%. But what tended to happen over time, even as those restrictions stayed in place, whether it's pandemic fatigue or whatever the case may be, is more people started and continued to travel, and we didn't see as much compliance. And so we haven't really seen very many states introduce new travel restrictions at this point. And if they were to, I'm kind of curious to see. Unfortunately, it's become somewhat of a political issue rather than just a public health issue. And I won't go on too much of a tangent there,
We
but
understand.
It's a complicated question, and with it, there are complicated solutions, certainly. And so I think from our perspective, we're continuing to track fatalities and traffic levels to try to see which of these kind of bad trends may be sustained moving forward and where we might see some opportunities for improvements there. But
driver education for young people probably have to change quite a bit. And then I just heard a news story today, which I should have anticipated, but they're having a problem getting bus drivers. Again, political because of maskless children, which I don't blame them. A lot of the bus drivers are retired folks who are the at-risk population. So I don't know what's going to happen there. And I don't know if you even look at bus crashes or what have you, but they're always devastating. Usually, I don't think they're as frequent, but maybe that's just my perception because, they're driving students around and they're usually mature drivers. But when they happen, it's like an airplane crash. It doesn't happen very often, but when it does, everybody dies, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So if we look, statewide, we see a relatively small number of those crashes on an annual basis. But to your point, they do receive a lot of media attention when they do occur. And I guess I can attest. I think it was either today or yesterday on the radio, I had heard advertisements about how they're looking for bus drivers here in our area as well. And so I'm sure that's a big issue nationally for some of those reasons that you noted.
Because it's a lot of training. It has to have a CDL, a commercial driver's license to drive a bus. So it's not something you just walk in the door and apply for. So it's going to be an ongoing issue. Maybe having more automatic systems on
buses make more sense. I don't know.
Yeah.
Up in the UP, though, I think up in the Upper Peninsula, they do a terrific job of keeping the roads clear. They have massive equipment and they don't have a whole lot of roads either. But like you say, maybe they're just better drivers. So Peter, do you have any closing thoughts at this point?
Well, I'd just like to thank you for the opportunity here. I think from our perspective, in the near term here, we'll continue to do some research to better understand what's driven some of these fatality increases that we've experienced. And, we historically work with the Michigan Department of Transportation and the Michigan State Police and its Office of Highway Safety Planning on a wide range of different projects that are focused on different aspects of the traffic safety problem. That includes ways that we can improve our design of the facilities to accommodate driver error, and then also ways to try to influence, how people drive and try to minimize some of these mistakes that are continually being made. And so I think all of us are taking a really hard look at the data that's available from the pandemic, and we'll be working as part of a broad consortium of stakeholders that try to improve things moving forward.
Well, thank you that you're taking this on, and you've got some folks working with it. We need the help. Certainly some surprising statistics, and I was kind of surprised at the seatbelt one, that the fatalities seem to be tied to that. One might have believed that the benefit of less driving would mean less fatalities, but obviously that was just an optimistic viewpoint. So again, thank you, Peter. You can contact him at pete@msu.edu. If you'd like more information about the conference or this podcast, please check our website at michsafetyconference.org. Thank you for listening to Safety Spectrum.